Good afternoon and welcome to a special Detroit Regional Chamber Town Hall on the topic of civility and racial equality. I hope everyone on the line today is healthy and well. And for those of you who have found a way to peacefully make your views known by exercising your First Amendment rights, thank you for your civic engagement. Since the death of George Floyd on a Minneapolis street late last month, we have seen a global movement that reminds us all that the ugliness of racism remains far too prevalent in our society, and that the disparities in treatment and economic and social outcomes for those of color remain insufficiently addressed by our society. And we're having this discussion while we deal with a global pandemic, as well as the most polarized political environment in 50 years. How to deal with these highly charged issues in a civil manner is no small feat. And to address this topic, I'm pleased to have two friends and partners in civility, Stephen Henderson, host of WDET's Detroit Today, and Nolan Finley, editorial page editor of the Detroit News. And I'll also note that both Stephen and Nolan are contributors to Detroit Public Television. Stephen, Nolan, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sandy.
So I'm going to enjoy this because usually this is the other way around. Usually you guys are interviewing me, so I'm going to really appreciate this opportunity to turn the tables.
Go easy.
So I'll go as easy on you as you are on me. How's that?
Okay, then. Fair.
All right, Nolan, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah.
So the three of us have been working together to stress the important role that civility plays in not only being able to understand those and be civil with those we may disagree with, but as a critical element of making progress. So how does civility and the passionate cries for progress work together in a time like this?
Well, we're going to have to be able to talk to each other to get through this. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. We can't continue to see these situations happen like the one that occurred in Minneapolis, this brutal death of George Floyd, have a big eruption, marches, then things settle down and, we tinker along the edges and nothing really changes in America. I mean, I think we're at a different place now. I hope we're at a different place. It feels somewhat different and more universal, but if we just walk away from this, feeling good because we put blackout posts on our Twitter account or we marched and never really get to the nitty gritty of what's wrong here. Police brutality is a symptom of a bigger problem. And if we just focus on addressing police brutality and don't talk with each other and work with each other beyond talking, work with each other about figuring out how to finally address the bigger issue of inequality in every aspect of our society. This is going to happen again and again and again until it just blows apart.
So Stephen, speaking of working together, one of the reactions we get from some quarters is that civility is just a code word for suppressing disagreements or not addressing difficult matters. What's your response to that?
Yeah, obviously, I don't interpret it that way. I don't mean it that way. And in fact, I believe that there are times and there are places when violent resistance to oppression is necessary and completely justified. And this is one of them. What we're seeing right now is a reaction to the lack of change, the lack of systemic change that we've needed for a really long time. But one of the things I've thought about a lot over the last couple of days is how civility does fit into that narrative and where it fits in that narrative. And one of the things I think that is really difficult right now is that one of the tenets of civility, as I see it, is that in order for us to have a civil conversation about something that we disagree on, I think the stakes have to be the same for both of us. In other words, I can't have more skin in the game than you do. You can't have more skin in the game than I do. And I can't stand to lose more than you do either. Right now, Black and brown people have way more to lose in this situation than anybody else. And that is what, in my mind, kind of prevents the utility of a civil exchange changing things at this point. How do you change that? You either lower the stakes for Black and brown people, something we've been asking America to do for a long time, so that the consequences of systemic racism, which we've lived with since the beginning of this nation, don't visit on us with lethal consequences over and over and over again, often at the hands of the state itself, or you raise the stakes for white America. And that's a really different proposition. In other words, what are the consequences that white America might face if we don't fix this? Do we raise the stakes for white America in a way that forces them to participate more in the dismantling of those systems? Those are both pretty difficult propositions to consider. Neither one is something that's going to be easy for us. But I do think that until we do that, it's hard to talk about the way that civility and the civil exchange of ideas, which is what will bring about systemic change, ultimately can take place. We kind of have to, we got to level the playing field a lot more than we have.
So, Stephen, that's
So, Sandy, if I can jump in on that, because
yeah, no, please. Go
I
ahead,
agree.
Nolan.
I agree with the raising the stakes for white people. I think the stakes are already high for them. I think bringing an understanding to what the stakes are, at least in some aspects. I mean, racism, inequality, very, very bad for business, very bad for the economy. There's a cost for all of us for this. And if we come to understand, those of us who aren't Black or brown, what this is costing us and what this is costing us in terms of economic prosperity and progress, along with the human relationships and the damage it's doing to people. It is really bad for business. And I think that's why I was glad to see our business leaders in this community step out and say, we're going to be part of the fixing, because, you know, it will benefit them along with everybody else. This is an altruism. I mean, this is something that has to be done.
So this is for both of you. Stephen, maybe you can go first. We've been here before. I mean, sadly, there have been incidences similar, very similar to the George Floyd incident. And we've had these moments of protest and outrage, but, you know, we kind of are still where we are. Are we truly in a different place right now? Have we really turned a page? Is the Floyd incident somehow systemically different than what we've seen in the past?
I'd like to say it is. I'd like to say that you know, the level of reaction to it is certainly higher than we've seen before. I mean, I think the intensity and widespread nature of the protests suggests a different reaction to it. I don't know that that it again raises the stakes highly enough for much of white America. I mean, I think Nolan's right that that you're starting to see some elements of institutions and businesses start to say, well, hold on a second, maybe we need to be more cognizant of this and act differently. But I think there is still far too much of America and far too much of white America that feels untouched by this. Even if they feel sympathetic, even if they might feel angry, this doesn't touch their lives in quite the way it needs to in order for the changes that we're talking about to take root. And I don't know what it is that needs to happen or will happen for that to be the case. You know, I mean, we've been at crossroads like this before in the history of this country, and even before it, where you have needed for a group of people who are suffering at the hands of another to really rise up and really to make it clear that there will be no peace, there will be no normalcy as long as we are victims of what's going on. And that's not me embracing the idea of violent insurrection, but that is me understanding it. It is me saying, I see how and why we are getting to that point. Are we there now? I don't know. I mean, I think it's very hard to tell day to day how long this will go on, how much it will ratchet up. But I do know that if we don't do the things that need to be done to de-escalate this in a way that stops, again, the consequences for Black and brown people, we're going to get there, and it could be very soon.
Sandy,
Nolan?
my view.
Yeah, your response.
My view of this is that I don't know if we've raised the stakes for white people, but I believe we've raised the expectations of Black people. All of these expressions of support, all of these promises from official corners, social media posts, the marching together, Black and white. I think it has raised expectation that there is something different this time, and that may produce real change. And I worry about the consequences if we don't meet that expectation, if we fall short of what we're promising here and just say, okay, we're going to study police brutality a little, we're going to put some policies in place involving demilitarization of our police departments and community policing, et cetera, and do nothing more than that. If we don't start looking at the achievement gaps in education, the income gaps, the opportunity gaps across the board, I think we'll fall short of the expectations we're raising here over the last week.
So Nolan, I think that's an absolutely critical issue because, regardless if we have turned a page or not in society with this, at the very least, the expectations have been risen. And I'm so glad you raised that point. So the question then to both of you is, expectations have been raised, consciousness has been raised, people are, for the most part, relatively united about the need to do something. The question is what? Because most people, regardless of the color of the outside of their skin, don't view themselves as taking any particular actions or lack of actions that are racist in nature. So how do we raise that level of what it means to white America or to the society in general?
Well, Sandy, I think the what we do is where we're going is where we'll need the ability to speak civilly, across racial lines, across all lines, because we won't agree on the solutions, but we need to agree to get to solutions. And that's where pragmatism has to trump ideology. And I think we do need to put a lot of different ideas on the table on how to fix our schools, on how to create more business opportunities for minority business people, small business people, how we create more opportunities in corporate America, how we create more Black wealth in this country. White households have on average 6.5 times more wealth than Black households in this country. What do you do about it? I would explore privatizing Social Security. Somebody else might have a different idea, but we need to be able to put all the ideas on the table and see what works. And we also need to confront people with some hard data. I would love to know what racism, inequality, what it does, what it takes away from our annual GDP in this country. What's the financial cost? Because that's something we all feel.
Stephen, how do we deal with this? How do we, all those things that Nolan just mentioned, none of those are actions, if successful, would change the outcomes in a short period of time. I think we have a society that wants change sooner rather than later. How do we square that wheel?
I mean, I think you do have to think about it both in terms of dismantling systems that hold people back and making up for the tremendous amount of unfairness and inequity that has unfolded over the lifetime of this country. People don't like to talk about things like reparations because it makes them uncomfortable. It says to white America, you might have to give something up that you gained illicitly as a way of making it right with Black and brown people. I think we have to have that conversation. I think we have to talk about what that means. Maybe it doesn't have to just mean checks written to people, but opportunities that are opened up as a way of making things right. These are things that the people who are in power, in business, in government, even in philanthropy, have shied from. That there has never been a serious conversation about that in this country.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I mean, I think I think in addition, we have to start talking about things like housing in this country. Housing is not just about where we live, it's about how we grow wealthy. African Americans and other brown people have been locked out of that wealth since the beginning and continue to suffer from the effects of having been locked out legally for so long. Now it's a de facto system that keeps them and keeps us out. How do you talk about housing fairness in a way that that makes up for that, not just fixes it going forward, but says, hey, we're going to do something that maybe seems on its face unfair in the moment, and that it would specifically advantage Black and brown people, but is a remuneration for things that were done wrong in the past. And that is often the stumbling block, I think, between us on these things, is doing those things that we know would make a difference now versus saying, well, we'll give you opportunity for the future.
So, Stephen, let me ask you a question that you're going to think is quite naive. What specifically are the systemic blocks against housing access for the African American community right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not about the law, right? We changed that in the 60s, and over time,
why I'm asking the question, right?
That's made a big difference. But look at housing patterns now. I mean, if you look at, first of all, the wealth that was gained before the law was changed is ridiculous. I tell this story all the time about my father, who was born in 1933 in Mississippi. Grows up and serves in the Korean War, and comes home at a time when the GI Bill is giving all kinds of opportunity to people who did exactly the same thing that he did. He and other African Americans are locked out of that GI Bill. What does that mean? That means they don't get to go to college. That means that they don't get low interest loans on houses to buy and start to build wealth for their families. This is not some ancient relative of mine that I read about in a book. This is the first man I knew, and this is the man whose life patterns mine. There is an unfairness there that has to be fixed. And so even if you believe that the patterns of housing today, the rules of housing today are fair, and in many ways they are much fairer than they were before, although banks still play, I think, a very important role in the way in which that fairness plays out, or it becomes unfairness. But even if that were all fixed, you still have this incredible imbalance, this incredible wealth that was built up by white people taking advantages that were not offered to others. How do you fix that other than to talk about remunerating that, to talk about making up that gap? So as much as it's about, for me, fixing housing now, it is about compensating for the housing wrongs of the past.
So Nolan, what's your take on Stephen's take of society is going to have to do some things that may appear unfair in the short term to help some to make up for, I'm just going to say, past sins? Where do you fall on that? How would you
I don't know that we need to, rob Peter to pay Paul or whatever. I think we're going to have to make a tremendous investment in fixing things like housing inequality and income inequality, education inequality. I think it's going to require a huge investment, but I wouldn't characterize as taking from one and giving to the other. I think there's a tremendous return for everyone if we do these things. I think we have to invest in our urban communities, but that's good for people black and white. It's good for society as a whole. I think we have to raise our education achievement levels. That is a positive benefit for everyone. And I think if you cast it, my concern is if you cast it as, hey, you got to give to us because you took for us, before, I think you got to make people understand this is good for everybody. This is, there's a return on here that will benefit all of us, but it is going to require a tremendous investment.
Right. Let me shift gears with you both for a minute here. So the protests, now they've been going on for over a week, seem to have a bit of a split screen effect to them. During the day, when we watch the news, we see people walking, protesting peacefully, oftentimes walking in unison with our law enforcement officers. But at night, when we turn on the TV, when we're getting ready to go to bed, we see a different element of that protest. How should the average person sitting at home who is horrified about what happened to Mr. Floyd think about the destruction that they see to police cars, to businesses on the street? Nolan, let's start with you on this one.
Well, it's not just destruction. It's not just property destruction. It's not just disobedience or civil disorder, whatever you want to call it. People have lost their lives in these protests, and to me, that's unacceptable. To have marches and protests that stem out of the death, the unjustified and brutal death of one person, and then have other people throughout the country, including black people, brutally killed. I can't accept the collateral damage of this. I don't fully understand what's going on with the violent part of it. It seems like there are a lot of people participating in that who haven't suffered the sort of things that the African Americans who are marching today have suffered. There seems to be some opportunism at work there, but I don't know. I'm not out there. I don't know what fully is going on.
Stephen, what should people at home think about the destruction that we see after dark?
I mean, I think for starters, you got to keep it in perspective. It is not the full picture of what's going on. It's not even close to the full picture of what's going on. I think American media has done a fair to less than fair job, I think, of conveying that. The numbers of people involved in the peaceful demonstrations have far outweighed the number of people involved in violent action. At the same time, I think we need to understand where violence comes from and why it takes place. Violence is an expression of last resort for those who feel they have no other means to get their point across. And to the extent that you're talking about Black and brown people dealing with police violence, dealing with systemic inequality, there are a lot of people who feel that way. There are a lot of us who feel that way, and there is not another way that we think of to be heard. I also would ask white Americans in particular to look at where did African Americans in this society learn violence from as a means of resistance? They could have looked to the founding fathers of this country who felt as though they were being oppressed, that their rights were not being recognized by Britain, and they staged a violent overthrow of that government. We think of that as heroic. We think of that as patriotic to understand that. I don't know what the difference in people's minds could be between what George Washington and others felt in 1776 and what African Americans and other brown people feel today. I think that's a really important part of the problem, is that we are still seen as other. Somehow this violence being perpetrated here is not noble or respectable. The question is why? Is it because of the cause that they're associated with, or is it because of the color of the people who are perpetrating it?
But if you watch this, a lot of the worst of the violence being carried out by people other than Black and brown people, and
well, that's important.
I'm not so certain they're acting in solidarity as much as they're acting in their own agenda, whatever that might be, whether it's sheer opportunism, whether it's anarchy, whatever it is. But a lot of the worst of the incidents, including the killings, have been carried out by people other than the people who have suffered from racism and inequality. And I don't know how you reconcile that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, I think the focus on that is misplaced, given that all of this is in reaction to a systemic devaluing of Black life. It doesn't really matter who in the protests is perpetrating violence or peace or anything like that. All of this owes to the systemic inequality that Black and brown people face. And so it's something of a distraction, in fact, and maybe even a cynical distraction for people to be talking about, well, who are the people who are doing this and are they justified? The moment is actually about what happened to inspire this. It is not necessarily about the semantics of how it unfolds. I also would say that you know, I don't think it's any one person's place to say to another who feels like their rights are being violated how they ought to get the foot off their neck, so to speak.
Stephen, I'm going to play devil's advocate just a bit here, because I don't disagree with you, but when the protest elements that are violent and destructive has a negative pressure on the outcome that the vast majority of protesters, and frankly those at home, want to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, that's always a problem when you're talking about something like this, is that you know, people with their own agendas can glom on and do things that harm the message of the majority. I guess what I'm asking for is for people to be sophisticated enough when they're viewing this to understand that that's what's happening. This is not in and of itself, at least not right now, a movement coalesced around violent reaction to the things that are happening. These have been peaceful demonstrations for the vast majority. I don't think it's fair, in fact, to paint the motivations of this protest with the actions of those who have decided that it should be violent. At the same time, as I said, I don't think that violence should be beyond the reach of the tools that this movement may need to employ, because peaceful protest has not worked. If we've learned anything in the last few weeks, it's that it hasn't. Remember Colin Kaepernick, 2016, that's 4 years ago. He kneels during the national anthem is called every name in the book, he loses his job. And white America basically says, don't disrespect our flag with your message of equality, which is thick with irony in and of itself. Today, what we're seeing is people demonstrating in a more aggressive way, in a more demonstrative way, and we're being told, well, the violence is not acceptable. Well, the peace wasn't acceptable. The point is that the things that are inspiring this are what need changing, not the way that people choose to push back against it.
So Nolan, I would love your reaction to what Stephen just said about, you know, violence being perhaps an appropriate tool because, as Stephen said, the peace has not worked.
Well, when you say that, then you have to accept the collateral damage. And a lot more people have been killed over the last week, many of them Black people who had lives that mattered, families that valued them, and roles in society. They were people too. They were people of value. And I can't accept the collateral damage of violent protests. And I don't think they're entirely necessary. I think the overwhelming number of people who filled the streets for the peaceful marches, taking a risk in this time of pandemic, sent the message that needed to be sent. I don't think white America is reacting today the way it is reacting in solidarity and support, at least verbally, because of the violence. I think it's because of, one, the video. I think it's hard to watch that video and not understand this was dead wrong. And one of the things that's different this time, you haven't heard a lot of blaming of the victim this time, as we have in past cases. You know, that video was very powerful. The marches were very powerful. I think the violence is harming and giving people an excuse to turn their ears off to what's being said in the daytime.
Well, how many videos?
I was just going to say, Nolan, I think you're right that there's, there are people who are maybe, I'm going to call them new to this cause. The Floyd incident has converted them, who could easily be unconverted if the violence gets out of control. And that would be my concern as someone who wants to, make some progress on this, this vexing issue that we have just not been able to make a dent in.
Yeah, but how many videos like this have we seen? I mean, this one is a degree more egregious than some of the others because of the way it unfolds. But Eric Garner,
well, we also have more of it. I mean, we have this video is kind of more complete at its unit. Sometimes we just see kind of a portion of it, and we don't know more about the backstory. This one was just, clear in what we saw is like, okay, it doesn't matter almost what the backstory was. This is just, we're watching someone be killed, by a tire of a police SUV.
Yeah.
And there's a cumulative effect too. We have seen a lot of these.
So Eric Garner in New York is killed under almost identical circumstances. I mean, there's almost no difference. Literally, he's saying the same thing to the officers as he's drawing his last breaths. I can't breathe. That's years ago, and it's not that I'm not moved by the reaction of people who were unmoved by that to what happened to George Floyd. But I think from the seat of somebody who has to worry about this for himself, for my son, for other African Americans that I know, that's not enough. I mean, Eric Garner should have been enough for everything to change, and it wasn't. And that happened before Colin Kaepernick started kneeling. It's not been enough. And I think that's what you're seeing in the streets right now.
I think there's a cumulative effect. I think people watched this incident and they've watched the previous incident, and each time it gets harder to deny, it gets harder to maintain that these are isolated incidents or that there was some precipitating cause for this. I think clearly in this case, people can see that's not true.
There's some really compelling national polling that I'm sure you have both seen, that there really does seem to be kind of a sea change in attitude where almost a majority said that, oh, these are isolated incidents. Now we're seeing almost a super majority say, no, this is a systemic issue. And I think that is a hugely comforting fact as we kind of move forward in trying to address this.
Yeah, now it goes to Washington. Now it goes to Washington, where it'll get thrown in that whole cesspool, and the right and the left will go to battling, and people will the opportunists will stand up and take their role. I think we can't this time rely on Washington to fix this. I think people have to put in place what fixes they can in their own communities. If we're going to wait for Washington to come up with a inequality plan, I think we're never going to get it.
So I want to get to the 2020 election and how this incident is going to impact that. But before we get to the national level, I want to go local here for a bit. So here in Detroit, and I've received emails from friends of mine back home in Portland and in Washington, D.C. saying, hey, it's really awesome that Detroit has really been able to keep all of your protests peaceful. The police have handled this well. Your mayor's handled this well. We saw, how the Flint police chief or sheriff up there in Genesee handled it. What's different about Detroit than our friends in, Washington, D.C. or Cleveland or Minneapolis or other places where we're able to seemingly handle this in a more productive fashion than some other places?
Well, I would say that I think, there's no question that this has looked different here than it has in many other places. And response of the city, of the police department has been, I mean, there have been some times when I have thought it has been inappropriate and over the top. I mean, I think that the violence that some journalists faced who were covering this was inexcusable, for instance. Maybe that was just about confusion and not targeting. I'm not exactly sure, but it has been better here than other places. But I would say that that's a result of a really long road that we've traveled in Detroit, going back to the 1950s and 60s, even before that to the 1940s, where this police department was a bad actor with regard to people's rights, Black people, white people, all kinds of people. I mean, it was under a federal consent decree not a decade ago for treating people inappropriately. It has been a long journey to the idea that the police have to respect citizens as citizens, and I'm not going to be the person who sits here and says, "Oh, we made that journey and we're done in Detroit." But I just think we've traveled a lot further along that path than some other communities where it's clear that the police see themselves as an occupying force still, and that their job is to put down any resistance to them or to the state, and that we continue each day, I think, to see examples of that. Buffalo, just the other day, a 75-year-old man gets knocked down and dealt a concussion by cops for just walking up to him. You're not.
His head was cut open.
Yes.
In that incident.
I don't feel like we're seeing as much of that kind of thing here. The police here don't seem to have that same reflexive, oppressive attitude, and I think that has to do with the work, a lot of work and sacrifice that was done to change the nature of that department.
I would credit James Craig. I think he's done a good job of building community relations and also holding police accountable when they do cross a line. He has not been hesitant to hold people responsible in his department from the reaction. I do think he's got to address the racial makeup of that police force and figure out ways to bring more African-American officers into the force. So whatever those barriers are, whether it's past history or whatever, I think he's got to work harder. The city has to work harder in resetting the racial balance of that police department.
So you both mentioned the importance of the business community, and I think you both mentioned when like Mary Baruah and her colleagues, Chris Ilitch and others, gathered with the mayor shortly after the Floyd death and made some unifying statements. So business certainly has a role here. Nolan, you wrote as early as 2014 in your column, where are the Black people in Detroit's Renaissance? So what is the combination of actions needed that businesses that are driving and participating and benefiting from Detroit's Renaissance, what do they have to do in order to make those words that they said with the mayor really mean something?
I mean, they've got to do it themselves. They can't wait, for it to be forced on them by, politicians or what have you. When we wrote and had those discussions back in 2014 and 2015, we were so excited about Detroit's rebirth, we didn't stop to look around and see how uneven it was and how a lot of people getting shut out. And Steve and I talked a great deal about this and documented a number of incidents at that time where people just were oblivious to the fact that this comeback was excluding so many African Americans, so many Detroiters. And we said then, and I think it's true now, we got to be intentional. And I think once people started thinking about it and looking at it, I think they did begin taking intentional steps to make sure we all come along together here. I think you see a lot more Black-owned businesses downtown, particularly in the entertainment sector. It's not so much it's not so much an all-white experience when you're downtown, but it isn't fixed by a long shot. I think you still got to fill more of the office buildings downtown with African American employees. more of the housing units. It's not over by a long shot.
Stephen, what do businesses need to do?
So, I mean, you start with the businesses that came together this week, and what is an historic moment? You know, I had a conversation with Reverend Wendell Anthony about this, and he said, "When's the last time you saw this?" And the answer is never. So that's in and of itself an achievement that you got them all to show up and say what they said. But those specific businesses have histories that need addressing in terms of the ways in which they played into inequality, helped fuel inequality. What are they willing to do to address those histories? Are they willing to go back into the past and reckon with the things that they did and figure out ways, again, to make up for those actions? It's not enough just to say, well, this happened and we acknowledge it. I think you have to say, here's what we're going to do going forward. Here's how we are going to fix that in the past and go forward in a different way. The car companies, go to the C-suites of the car companies, look around. That is the easiest indicator of how much work still needs to be done there, as much as has been done and as much progress has been made. You know, we have some examples of this around the country now. I think a lot about what's going on at Georgetown University over the last couple of years, a university that at one time sold slaves as a way of shoring up the university's finances. They went and they tracked down the families of all of those slaves who were sold and started talking about how to make up for what was done. They have instituted all kinds of scholarships and opportunity based on trying to pay back for what they took from those families. It's difficult. It's been really, really hard at Georgetown for people to get their minds around it and to accept that this needed to be done. But it's healing that university. It's healing that space with regard to this stuff. I think you got to start thinking about those things in every American institution, and that includes all businesses.
I would disagree, Sandy, just in part in terms of that we'd not seen this before in our city's history. After 1967, you had Henry Ford, Max Fisher, and Step Up and Detroit Renaissance Forum and New Detroit Forum, and they made a powerful start, and then it stopped, and then it went unfinished. And I think there's cautionary tale there that you got to see things through. We didn't see it through then, and got to see it through this time.
So what are the factors that prevent us from seeing things through? I mean, you know, obviously I wasn't here in 1967. What was it, what were the factors in Detroit? Because that's when like New Detroit, I believe, was created, correct? And Governor Romney was involved. I mean, this was obviously a big issue and had tremendous public and private support and energy around it. What prevented it from seeing it through?
Well, Sadie, I don't know all the answers to that, but I know, I have a 3-year-old granddaughter, and when she's hollering, we give her a lot of attention. When she's laying there quiet, we don't notice her. I think you got to keep the pressure on. You got to keep the noise up. You've got to put expectations in place, and then there have to be consequences for not meeting them.
Yeah, I mean, everyone gets comfortable after a time, and small steps forward start to look like they're much bigger than they are in the face of a crisis. Somebody does something that they might not have done before, and we overestimate its impact or its value. I think you have to, as Nolan says, keep the pressure on to talk about how deeply these problems run, and that all of the solutions for them are hard to come up with and are going to be even harder to implement because they ask us to think really differently about all aspects of American life. There are a lot of things that have to change, and I'm not sure that everybody is aware that that change needs to affect them and their lives for it to really matter for the people who are at the bottom of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the question for the obvious reason, right? I mean, this is going to be a long road to really address these issues and to start to see a real tangible, I'm going to use the popular phrase, flattening of the curve, right, on these issues. And, we as human beings famously have a very short attention span. So I want to move, because we only have a few minutes left here, I want to move to the realm of public policy, particularly how this situation is going to play into the 2020 election, both for president, but also here locally. We have several races. We have a high-profile U.S. Senate race up. Nolan, how is this incident going to change the dynamics of the 2020 presidential race?
Well, I think that's an excellent question because always, we're still a long way out from November. I think it, just from a purely candid position, I think it looks bad for Donald Trump and by extension, Republicans. And, I think you're going to see a huge Democratic turnout in the fall, just as we saw in 2018, even though the Democrats aren't posting an all that exciting candidate. I think this is going to turn people, particularly younger people, out to the polls. It's hard to imagine you'll have the same African-American turnout in 2020 in Detroit as you had in 2016. And if they turn out in their typical numbers, Donald Trump doesn't have a chance of winning Michigan. So I think it plays a huge role. The question is how far down the ballot it goes. The Republicans are posting a very attractive African-American Senate candidate this year. Does he benefit at all from this recognition that we need more African-American voices in high places? I don't know.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the Senate race here in Michigan because we do have two attractive candidates. But Stephen, 2020 presidential election, how is all of this going to play into that and impact who votes and how they vote?
Right now it seems impossible to predict what's going to happen in the next 24 hours because of the pandemic and all of this stuff. I mean, I have sort of sworn off too much of the prediction business for now, but I do think this plays a role, of course, in the president's difficulty getting reelected, not just because of the anger and the demonstrations, but his own responses to them have been so outrageous and even more over the top than what we've seen him doing in the past. I mean, all of those things will show up in Democratic ads that will not make it easy for him to make the case for himself. And if you look at the fact, I keep trying to remind people that this is someone who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes 4 years ago. The chances of him getting reelected, just repeating those circumstances, were slim. He's made them a lot slimmer by, I think, making a lot of people who did vote for him 4 years ago uncomfortable with the idea that they did that and unlikely to do it again. I also think that the way that we vote is going to have a huge influence on this election. The effect of the pandemic on in-person voting and the changes in Michigan law in 2018 that made it a lot easier for people to vote absentee. That's going to be true in a lot of states. That is going to get a lot more people voting than we normally have. And turnout is Donald Trump's enemy, I think, not just in states like Michigan, but I think nationwide.
I will add a caveat, Sandy, that both Steve and I were as wrong as we could be in picking the winner of the 2016 elections. Before others remind us of that, we'll do it ourselves.
Yeah, no, I get reminded of the same thing, and I have the further blemish of still having a Jeb Bush sticker on one of my cars. So you kind of know how I took the 2016 election. So let's switch to the Senate race here in Michigan. We have two hugely compelling candidates. Obviously, Gary Peters has been a tremendous success as a senator. We have John James, who is an incredibly attractive candidate, and in my mind is running a fabulous campaign and with great ads. John James is an African American. He's a Detroiter, but he's also attached to Donald Trump if he wants to be or not. How does the dynamic of being an African American running as a Republican in Trump's Republican Party cut either for him or against him in a race against someone like Gary Peters?
Well, I think, it depends on how intense the outrage against Donald Trump is, how much straight ticket voting it drives. And Michigan is a large straight ticket voting state in the first place. But I write Sunday, one of the answers we have to look at here in dealing with inequality and racism is bringing more African Americans to Congress, not just to the House, but to the Senate, and African Americans on both sides of the aisle. You've got to have people speaking to both caucuses, not simply African Americans simply can't be a niche of Congress that belongs to the Democratic Party. It's more effective if they're on both sides of the aisle and more likely to bring a consensus. And I also think we need younger people in Congress. We need a much younger Congress. This current generation, these current younger folks, much more comfortable living and loving across racial lines than their parents and grandparents were. I think it's time to replace their parents and grandparents with a younger generation who are more open to these discussions and these ideas.
Stephen, the Senate race?
Yeah, so I mean, John James' fundamental problem is that it is too easy to view him as a black face in a party that is not about black people, and he's going to have to distinguish himself a lot more than he has in order to dispel that notion that people have. When he jumps all over the opportunity, the gaffe that Joe Biden had, talking about who's black and who's not with a radio host, that raises a lot of money for him in Republican circles. But what African Americans remember is John James' absence, absolute absence over the last 4 years, talking about the overtly racist things that this president has done and said, and saying, well, I'm with him 1,000%. That does not square with a lot of voters. And you're also talking about him running against Gary Peters, who is a very popular sitting senator, popular not just with African American voters and Democrats, but somebody who does really well all the way up into Macomb and St. Clair counties in ways that a lot of Democrats do not. Do not underestimate Gary Peters' connection with working white voters, which is one of the things that has really propelled him in the past. I feel like John James has a lot of work to do if he's gonna be competitive. The latest poll average is James down by almost 7 points. That's a lot in June.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. I will say that some of my favorite conversations that I've had since moving to Michigan have been with the two of you, either on the air or perhaps even more importantly, over a bourbon in a backyard.
You
So
still got
thank
some of
you.
that happy, Sandy?
Yeah, that's why I have the sign behind me to cover up the pappy.
Hey, Sandy,
Stephen was actually over right before the pandemic and helped me open a bottle of pappy.
You are probably are the root cause of the spread then. Before we go, let us put a plug in for the Civility Project. Steve and I have been engaged in this project. We started with the chamber, became more formal this year. We're available to speak to groups, any size, any sort throughout our state, thanks to the support of Delta Dental Plans of Michigan. We have the ability to do that, and we welcome the invitations.
And I would say, kudos to the chamber for having us do this, but this is a good example. It's a great example, I think, of the necessary forums to be able to have these conversations. We said things to each other during this conversation that I think might have led other people to come to blows, right? Or to say, I don't talk to that person. Nolan and I are really committed to the idea that no matter what the idea is, how offensive it might be to the other person, we can have this conversation and do it in a way that is productive and leads to solutions. The Civility Project is all about that, but both Nolan and I's work, I think, is also about that. So.
Well, that is an area where the three of us and others have been working hard on. I in the chamber, we believe, and that's why we enjoy working with the two of you so much, is that if we're going to make progress in society, we're not going to make progress by yelling at each other. You know, just by yelling at each other just solidifies people into their corners. It hardens their positions. And at the end of the day, we are a nation of 330 million people. Each one of the ideas that rattle around in our 330 million brains are just as valid as the one next door. And if we're going to work as a society, we need to be able to come together as 330 million individuals in a way that respects the rest of them. I can't do that math. But,
yeah,
so,
well said,
yeah.
Andy. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. I look forward to seeing you in person soon. Thank you for joining us, and for our audience, thank you again for joining us here at the Detroit Regional Chamber. Have a great weekend. Continue to be safe and enjoy this fabulous weather that we're expecting. Stephen,
Thanks.
Nolan, thank you. Have an awesome day. Take care.
Thank you.